Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie Affinito, your KidLit loving host, inviting you back for another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Bobbie Pyron. Bobbie is the author of multiple middle grade and young adult novels. Her titles include Stay, A Pup Called Trouble, Lucky Strike, The Dogs of Winter, A Dog's Way Home, and The Ring. She's here today to talk about her newest novel, Octopus Moon, a deeply moving middle grade novel in verse about a young girl navigating depression at the start of 5th grade. This is a beautiful lyrical novel that so many readers will need, and I cannot wait to dive deep into this one. So let's just do that. Bobbie, welcome to KidLit Love. I am thrilled that you are here today.
I'm thrilled that I'm here too. I'm so happy to be here. As I mentioned before we started recording, this is my very first podcast I have ever done. And I'm a little nervous, but I'm really so excited to talk with you.
I am so excited. First, I was excited just to talk about the book because it was a book that I could not put down and I had to read in one sitting. But now knowing that this gets to be your first podcast is even more exciting to me. So I'm so grateful that you're here. Now, while we are talking about Octopus Moon, I do want to start at the beginning. And I would love for you to just take time to introduce yourself to listeners and give us a little back history on your journey into children's literature.
Sure. So I am what you would call a late bloomer. I wanted to be a writer from the time I was about 9 years old. Books were so important to me when I was growing up because I was really shy. I struggled mightily with depression, and my best friends were books and dogs. So I just wanted to be a writer and see my books on a library shelf or whatever and touch some other reader. But it was a long journey. I did a lot of other things before I became a writer, and I was a librarian, which is, by the way, the best profession in the world, for many years, 30 years really, before I started publishing. My first book didn't come out until I was almost 50. So I've been trying to make up for lost time since then. But it has been a long journey. I'm a good example of it's never too late to achieve your dream.
Oh, what a beautiful message. As you're talking, I'm thinking, it's not too late, Stephanie. It's not too late. So I love that you just started that at the top. And it's not like you just have one book. You've got a bunch of books behind you. So you did make use of your time once you got rolling.
I did. I think, and this is to especially all the women out there who aspire to write and have kids. I had to wait until my stepkids were at an age where I didn't feel like they needed me constantly, right? And so I had to have that space, that physical, but also that emotional space to start writing. And that wasn't until I was almost 50, but I had been thinking about it for such a long time. So I was just, I was kind of ready to go. I had a lot of support from my husband. And so, yeah, yeah.
So tell us about that first book.
That
Just a
first
little
book,
bit.
the interesting thing is I started out writing picture books. I thought I wanted to be a picture book writer. Um, But one day I was out hiking and this kind of snarky teenage girl voice started talking in my head about how unfair life is and how nobody understands her and the world sucks and so forth. And so I started only way I could get that voice out of my head was to start writing it down, and that eventually became The Ring, which was my first book. It was published in 2009, and it was a little bit inspired by my stepdaughter when she was a teenager going through some typical teenage girl stuff. But it is about a young girl, teenager, who kind of loses her way and her self-confidence and finds herself through boxing.
So is that how books come to you? Do you just hear a piece of the voice or something you just can't get out of your head and you have to write about?
Well, that's a good question. Usually the plot comes to me first, and then I can't really start writing until the voice comes. But with The Ring, it was completely the opposite. And that hasn't really happened since then. I think about a story for a long time before I ever start writing it. I'm not an outliner. I'm what we call in the writing world a pantser. I
Yes.
by the seat of my pants. But that being said, I think about a book for a long time before I actually sit down and start writing it. So I basically know the beginning, middle, and end of the book. Not that that doesn't change, but then when the voice comes, whether it's first person or third person, but it has to be a very solid voice before I can sit down and start writing.
And I imagine you have to be in a place. I love how you started off by saying you needed the space.
Right.
If you don't have the space, you don't hear those voices. You don't take those next steps to write them down.
Exactly. And one of the things that I learned the hard way was a lot of times that voice comes when I am being physically active. Or, and this is a joke in the whole writers community, we call it the magic water closet. Invariably, if I'm caught up in a plot tangle that I don't can't see my way out of, I take a shower and it just comes clear. And there I am in the shower. So I learned to start leaving little spiral notebooks and pens in the bathroom, in my backpack when I hike, in the console of my car. Um, so yeah, you got to be ready when it strikes, when the muse shows up, because she'll disappear pretty quickly.
Yes. Oh my gosh, Bobbie, we would be fast friends in real life because I also have notebooks everywhere for that exact reason. One that could fit in the pocket on the walk, one that fits in the purse for the car, one that's by the bed. I even almost bought, I didn't do it yet, but I almost bought, and maybe this is something that you would like, those special sticky notes that you can write on in the shower that
Oh
don't
wow.
that don't kind of wash away. They are waterproof sticky notes and markers. So tuck that away for a little special something later
Oh,
on.
boy, that's genius. I'll have to let some of my friends know about that.
I will send you the link after we are done recording today. So you're talking about getting your ideas, and maybe the plot comes to you, maybe the voice comes to you when you're quiet. But thinking about the book we're talking about today, Octopus Moon, did that book kind of come to you differently given your own experiences as a child and maybe how I guess I would say embedded you must have felt in that story
Right.
as it came to you?
That's a really good question. Friends of mine, author friends of mine, had encouraged me for a long time to write about my childhood, and I just said I didn't want to do it. But as I saw the statistics going up and up, or children, and not just teens, but young children struggling with depression, I started feeling like, this is a book that's needed. And then this was when I was working as a librarian, and I was on a listserv, and somebody on there said, does anybody know of any middle grade novels where the main character has depression? Not the parents, not a friend, but the main character. And I started looking, and there just really wasn't much of anything. There were some books about, where the main character had OCD, or, some other things. I like to say that depression is kind of the common cold of mental illnesses. It's not real glamorous. It's not quirky and complex, and I don't want to sound dismissive, but kind of colorful, like some of the other things. It's just depression, and it just grinds you down.
Mhm.
And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, I need to try and tackle this topic.
Mhm. So, can you give listeners a little overview of the book? We are a couple of days away from your release date, from the book birthday. And so this book is likely newer to them. I'd love for you, in your own words, to tell the reader, the future reader, what Octopus Moon is about.
Right. So Octopus Moon, and it's a novel in verse, so it's poetry, but it doesn't rhyme. A lot of my favorite books are written in verse,
Yeah.
and it's the story of a 10-year-old girl named Pearl, and she has always kind of struggled with depression. She's always worried a lot. She's always had these days when she felt really down, and there wasn't any reason why. But she's always been able to manage her dark days with certain things like running and spending time with her friends, getting involved in um, helping her mother who works at the aquarium. And all those things, kind of kept the darkness at bay. She could outrun her anxiety and depression until she couldn't. And I think all of us who have struggled with depression hit that point. Kind of what was the change for Pearl was the summer before fifth grade. Everything started changing a little bit. Her friends, as often happens at that age, her good friends, started doing things separate from what, they'd always done things together. And then fifth grade happens, and there's a lot of changes that happen with fifth grade. In a lot of schools, you start changing classes for the first time. In a lot of schools, you have a locker for the first time. You may not be with your friends that you've always eaten lunch with. And she just gets really overwhelmed by all the changes. Myself personally, and I have struggled with depression for most of my life. Um, Change is very difficult. Routine is safety for me and for most people with depression. So these changes really throws Pearl for a loop, and all of a sudden she finds that no matter how hard she runs, she cannot outrun the depression. Usually she's excited to start school and start a new grade and learn things. She's very curious, but now, all of a sudden she can't deal with it. And so it's a real turning point for her. Her old tools of coping with depression and the bits of anxiety she have no longer works. And so the book is about her, not just her finding new tools and ways of dealing with depression, but also how it affects her family and her friends, and discovering some familial links to depression that run in her family.
There are so many things I want to ask you about and bring up. I'm not sure where I want to start because this book just had all of the feels in all of the places. But I think one place that seems like a logical starting point, at least one thing the book did for me, one thing I think the book can remind everyone about depression is that while invisible, it is very real, just as a physical illness or a physical challenge that we can see is. But the
Yeah,
fact that it is invisible tangles up so many emotions around it of what people think, what they feel, how they perceive depression to be. And I felt like the book really tackled that head on of if you have depression, you know this, right?
mm,
But if you
yeah,
don't, it's very common, I would say, to have these misconceptions of what depression is and what it isn't, and how a person is impacted and how they aren't. And I felt like having that as a child, especially if this book, as we mentioned before we started recording, if this book is a mirror and you
yeah,
are identifying with the characters there, what validation is in these pages that
right.
this is real and this is a physical, just as real as a physical thing. And it's okay.
Yeah,
I just wanted to say that right at the top. I feel like it's a beautiful story as well as an education for
yes.
all of us on what depression is and the misconceptions people might have.
Well, and that is certainly my great good hope about the book. But one thing that I'm not sure a lot of people think about, I know for myself, and I still feel this way, and I'm older than dirt, but but there's a lot of shame associated with mental illness. And part of that is because we feel like, what right do I have to be depressed? And Pearl feels that way many times in the book. What right do I have to be depressed when here's her best friend Rosie, who lives in a trailer with her grandmother and other people, and I struggle with that all the time. What right do I have to feel depressed when I'm a successful author and I have an amazing husband and wonderful friends, and there's a shame that is associated with that. uh, but yeah, like Pearl says, it would be easier if I had a broken leg or I was missing an eye or something obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that the book is really honest of how some of those misconceptions can even be in our own home or our
Yeah.
own families.
Yes.
The relationship between Pearl and her dad and the understandings and miscommunications there. And as you already mentioned, the familia connections that we kind of piece together with another family member as well. It's an honesty on those interactions. And I really loved reading as a reader to see how the family not just kind of butted heads there and had a different idea, but what they did to bridge it
Yeah.
together as well.
Right. Right. And it was interesting to me when I was first started writing this book. Even though like I said, I've struggled with depression for a very long time, I wanted to make sure I was getting things right. And so I met with a wonderful child therapist. I live near Asheville, North Carolina. And so I met with her down in Asheville and of course told her I was writing this book. And it was great because she said, even now, even though it's we do talk more openly about children having depression. 95% of the time, it's the teachers who alert the parent, that there is something out of the ordinary going on. Uh,
Mhm.
it's, the parents, you see them, every day. And I think part of it is parents don't want to recognize that their child has depression because, does that mean they're a bad parent?
Right.
But also, it's so easy just to say, oh, she's moody, she's a drama queen.
It's a
He-
phase.
He's always been so sensitive. It's just a phase, whereas the teachers see it differently. So yeah, she said that invariably, it's almost always the teacher that sends a note home with the parent or at parent-teacher conference and says, I'm worried about Pearl.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the therapist because as I was reading the book, I thought, can I go visit her?
I know.
Please. There was such a safety in that room, in that space. There was such a relief and a sense of comfort that came in that space that as a reader, I could feel Pearl. And I just kept thinking, yes, I want to go in and see her. And I felt like your inclusion of the therapist and getting that kind of sneak peek or I guess fly on the wall kind of view of what might go on in those sessions was just so enlightening as an outside person of how does the therapist convey what depression is and what it feels like and reduce that shame and give strategies not just to Pearl but to the person reading the book who
Right.
might be struggling, who might be able to borrow some of those strategies for him or herself. So could you talk more about that piece of how you just brought that beautiful safe therapy room into this book as well?
Well, when I was growing up in the 60s, late 50s, 60s, there weren't therapists for children.
Right.
And so that was part of why it was so important for me to talk with this child therapist. And we met on several different occasions, and she's read many drafts of Octopus Moon. And I needed to know what happens in therapy for a child that age, because I certainly didn't enter therapy until I was in my 30s. I had always imagined when I was imagining writing the book before I talked with her, I always imagined that there would be a group therapy, and I thought, oh, this will be great because I can bring in this character and that character, and I can do this and that, and get carried away with secondary characters like I always do. And she said, no, with this age group, we don't do that, just doesn't work with this age group. We do one-on-one. With teens, group therapy works really well, but with this age group, it really doesn't. They absolutely have to feel like they have a safe space. And so it's almost always one-on-one therapy. It's very, very often play therapy. The description of Dr. Jill's office is taken very much from Jillian Kelly, the therapist that I talked with, from what her therapy office looked like. And when I'd finish a draft, I'd send it to her and I'd say, okay, what is realistic and what isn't. And she gave me so much great feedback because I wanted to be sure that it was right. So that was extremely helpful. Um, I also based the therapist on a longtime therapist that I had for quite a number of years. That feeling of just it being such a safe, comforting place where I could say anything. Um, so those were kind of the inspirations for Dr. Jill and for that whole setting.
Well, and there honestly are a couple of things that I learned in those therapy sessions that I think any reader, child or adult, someone struggling with depression or not, can just take with them. And I thought and I hate because I don't like to give spoilers. And so I want the reader to find these things, but I'll just say there are a couple of really concrete, tangible practices that the therapist offers to Pearl, and Pearl tries things like trying one impossible thing that
Yes,
feels so
yes,
impossible before the next time, and then putting a tangible, and I won't say what it is so they can figure it out, but a tangible sort of celebration to say, look at how all of these little impossible things that feel impossible are stacking up to show that you can get through it, which is another theme of the book, that this is something that you can walk through. But I will admit something I did after I read your book. I said I read it in one sitting. I closed it. I sat with it. I had to hug it and keep it close for a
oh,
little while. And there was one thing that she did that just was so inspiring. And she had these little notes. In
yes,
the book, it says, every note, a little light of hope from me to me. And I
right.
cried because I cry easily, but I cried. And I wrote a little note of hope from me to me and thought, what a beautiful sort of practice to remind yourself when you need it of what you are capable of and what is inside of you. So I
Right.
feel like this book, yes, it's a mirror and yes, it's a window, but it's also hope.
And it was so important to me that the book not sugarcoat depression and say, oh, you can be in therapy for a few months and you're fixed.
Right.
Because there is not, unfortunately, a fix.
Yeah.
Um, like that anyway. So it was important to me though that the reader feel hope, because one of the things about depression, and I Pearl says in the book, is that no matter how depression manifests in you, and depression is not the same in every person, uh, but across the board, what it does is it steals your hope,
Mhm.
and that you don't understand, I think, how important hope is until you don't have it.
Mhm.
And then it really is like a light has completely gone off in your world. So it was very important to me that the book feel hopeful, that there are coping strategies, that you can have some really bad days. You can hit bottom, but you can also come back from that and have good days, and that's what those notes were all about. And that was a strategy that I learned from my longtime therapist, was writing those little notes and keeping them in a box so that I could go back and read those notes to myself.
Yeah. It's such a beautiful practice. It's actually behind me, so listeners can't see it, but you can. There's this little jar back here that
Yeah.
my son and my daughter, they're twins, so I was lucky enough to get two of them in one year. These little glass jars that they painted with these teeny tiny love notes to me. And reading that, I just couldn't help but think about that little jar and then how wonderful that any of us can create
Right.
that jar for ourselves when we need it. So I have one note in my personal note to
Oh,
myself, and
good.
I will keep writing in it.
I get, in some ways, and there's whole thing about gratitude, in the last few years, and and list three things you're grateful about. And sometimes that's hard. Uh,
Yeah.
and especially if you are feeling down. It's very hard. But just to be able to say, look at you, you made a dentist appointment today. Yay, you, you had
Yes.
the energy to do that. And truly, when you are really depressed, um, that can be a monumental task.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've got to celebrate those things and say, look what you did. This is great.
Can you talk more about the author's note at the end? Such an important part of the book, I believe.
Yeah, well, it was again that was kind of uh cutting open a vein and bleeding onto the page. I've always been a little bit private about my childhood, and I started discovering when I wrote Lucky Strike, which was several books ago, that kids really appreciate honesty. They just aren't judgmental like adults are. And I grew up quite poor. And in my book, Lucky Strike, the main character is poor. And when I do school visits and talk to kids about Lucky Strike, I finally got up the courage to tell kids, we were really poor. And same thing with my book Stay. Um, and the kids, you could just see it grabbed their attention, and they really appreciated the fact that I was being honest. And so, in the author's note for Octopus Moon, I mean, there were definitely things I left out, but I just decided I needed to be very honest and talk about the fact that I had struggled with depression probably since I was 5 or 6 years old. And no one in my family would acknowledge it. And I was described as overly sensitive and moody and oh, she cries at the drop of a hat and a worry wart and all these things. But nobody back then talked about depression in adults or in kids. I had some, growing up, especially when I hit my teen years, I had some uh, unfortunate ways of coping, with the depression. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I was finally diagnosed with anxiety and chronic depression. But uh, I wanted kids to understand that I kind of know whereof I speak
Mhm.
in this case. And talking about my grandfather, realizing years and years later that he most certainly had depression. Um, and my grandmother, I'm sure, was, in retrospect, she was bipolar. So mental illness definitely ran in my family, and also acknowledging the fact that, unlike Pearl, I didn't have the family support
Mhm.
that she has. I didn't have the friends that who were supportive, like Pearl had. And so it was extremely important to me to be as honest as I felt comfortable being.
Mhm. And that's what makes the book so emotional and powerful, I
Right.
believe. The author's note certainly, yes, but the reader can feel, I at least could really feel Pearl. I could feel what mom felt. I could feel what dad felt, even in his confusion. I could just feel it all. And I feel like it is that honest, raw part of you that showed up on the page that makes us readers just feel taken care of. It's a beautiful book. I cannot wait for listeners to read it, to read to their own inner child that perhaps needs it, and then pass it along to the children in their care. If I were to end with one question, I would love to ask you what your hope is for the book as it goes out into the world next week.
Well, certainly my biggest hope is that it will help destigmatize mental illness, especially in kids. I think kids are more open these days, but there is still, at least in our culture, there is still a lot of stigma around mental illness. And especially with depression, I think there's still that feeling of, well, just snap out of it, or, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, that sort of thing. So I hope that it will help with that. I hope it'll help readers who don't experience chronic depression see what it's like for a friend or a family member who does. But ultimately, I think for me, no matter what else happens with the book? If it just helps one kid out there who struggles with depression and feels alone and feels hopeless and feels scared, feel less alone, that would mean the world to me. When I wrote Stay, which is a book about a girl and her family who are experiencing homelessness, um, I had a number of emails from kids who had experienced homelessness with their families or were experiencing homelessness with their families. And they said, I never, ever thought I would see myself in a book, and that they felt seen. And, I say to kids when I do school visits, um, and it may have gotten me in trouble in a couple of school visits, but I always say every every person out there deserves to be seen in a book, no matter what their gender is, what their race is, what their gender identity is, what their mental illness is. No matter who they deserve to be seen in a book
Mhm.
and feel less alone. And that is my great good hope for this book, is that it'll help kids feel less alone, and then on the flip side help other kids understand what it is like for someone who is experiencing this.
Mhm. Well, as someone who read the book, I know it will do both of those things, as well as I would add help the parents and the caregivers and the other people in that child's life to understand what it is they may be going through and respond accordingly as well. That's a good kind of trouble I think you may have gotten yourself into, though. I support that
Well,
trouble.
I have to say, as a former librarian and as a children's writer, I'm very concerned about what's going on with book banning and so forth in the schools and in the not quite as much in public libraries, but certainly in the schools.
Mhm.
So I am very concerned about that, and I don't anticipate any problems for this book, but kids can handle the truth, and kids want the truth, and kids need the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, part of why I love having this podcast too, is because it's sharing all of the books in all of the forms and all of the ways so that readers get to make those decisions
Yes.
for themselves.
Right, right, absolutely. Yeah.
So where can listeners find you online if they want to find more of your books or talk to you about school visits, author visits? Where's the best place to contact you?
I have a wonderful, newly updated website, and it's just bobbiepyron.com. And it has links to all of my books. It has links for teachers and librarians to get in touch with me about school visits. I absolutely love doing school visits and meeting my readers, meeting all kinds of readers, whether they've read my books or not. And it also has a link on there that you can email me. Kids email me all the time. I also get snail mail. Invariably, it has glitter inside.
That's the best.
I open it, and then there's glitter all over the floor, and my husband's like, "Oh, okay, glitter. Well, we're gonna be wearing this for the next year." But yeah, I love hearing from my readers. I always answer every email, every written letter. I always write back. Uh, but yeah, there's a lot of good information. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Instagram a little bit. Mostly it's dog pictures that I post. And I am on Twitter. A lot of teachers and librarians follow me on Twitter.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I will be sure to put links to Octopus Moon, of course, but as well as your other titles that we discussed in the show notes. And I will certainly put links to the website and those social media handles that you discussed as well to make it easy for listeners to just click and find you and find your books and
Thanks.
settle in and be prepared to read in one sitting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bobbie, for coming on to KidLit Love today. This was a conversation I was so looking forward to, and I'm honored to be part of your launch of putting Octopus Moon out there.
Well, I am honored to be on your podcast. I so appreciate you getting in touch, and I can't wait to talk to you again at some point.
Yes, that's open door policy. Yes. So we will continue. To be continued is, I guess, how we could end.
Continued. Yes, yes. Yeah, we'll fix a cup of tea or coffee and just chat.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you so much. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of KidLit Love, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.